Good evening and welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. This is a program, part of our summer reading programming, which is called Build a Better World. And when we were doing the planning for summer reading and talking about what would be building a better world, one of the topics that came up was the driving simulator and the programs they do there. And distracted driving seems to me, and seems to us, our planning committee, that not being a distracted driver would be a way to build a better world. So we contacted the driving simulator folk, and this is part of a two-part program. Tonight is one, and then next week we'll have another one, and we're actually going to have a car here, right? Right, well, not here, but out there, outside the library. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Dr. John Gaspar, and he will tell a little bit about himself and then teach us about driver distraction. Thank you, John.
Thank you. All right. So thank you for coming. It's nice to be here to have a chance to talk about some of the work we do. So my name is John Gaspar. I'm a research scientist at the National Advanced Driving Simulator. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. And my background's really in kind of studying the limits of attention and how that translates to real-world behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about driver distraction. I'll start with what I think is kind of some interesting background. I think we all know that driver distraction is a bad thing, but I want to talk a little bit about why it's a challenge for us and why we're so bad at multitasking. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done and we're currently doing on vehicle technology and some of the implications for driver distraction. So we'll start with a video here that Dan McGahey provided me just before the talk. So this is some naturalistic data, so some data that was collected in a real car with some teenage drivers, which illustrates an instance of distracted driving. So what we're going to see is a very long look away from the road by the driver, and you'll see that she gets pretty lucky to stay on the road. And I still can't believe the passenger just sits there. So you can see that she gets lucky by hitting the curb, but she has this really long look away from the road where she's looking down, I think at a mobile phone or something like that. And she just completely misses approaching the curb and is lucky to get bounced back into the lane. So one of the reasons I was excited to be able to talk a little bit about this was because within the last few weeks, Iowa has updated this new distraction law, which basically is an anti-texting piece of legislation, which basically bans sending or viewing text messages while you drive. There are some limitations to this, and I think we can get back to this at the end if there's questions, but it's kind of a step towards trying to limit the amount of distraction we have in our cars. Okay, so to very quickly define, I think what we as researchers would describe as driver distraction, at the very highest level, it's this diversion of attention away from the activities that we perform to be able to drive safely. And it's this diversion of attention towards some other task. So we've all experienced distraction while we drive, whether it's looking at text messages, making a phone call, attending to your crying baby in the back. And now as our cars get more and more complicated with new technology that we may or may not understand, the types of distraction are kind of increasing, at least the variety of distraction tends to be increasing. And we know that distraction is a bad thing. I think we're all familiar with at least the general concept that distraction leads to crashes, and still a very high number of crashes and fatal crashes, and still really a huge number of drivers using electronic devices on a daily basis. Okay. I want to step back in time just a little bit and talk a little bit very generally about the history of driver distraction. And the point I want to make broadly is that it's not a new concept. So this image here shows kind of a cartoon or a comic from the 20s or 30s. And the debate then was whether we should be putting radios inside of cars. And there's quite a bit of pushback at the time to limit even having radios installed in cars, with the idea being that having a radio is going to distract you from the task of driving. And the debate really hasn't changed much in the last almost 100 years now. Just the types of distraction that we're engaging in have changed. So much of the research over the last 20 years has focused on different cell phone interactions, so making and receiving calls, sending text messages, et cetera. And the debate kind of has continued into some of the newer vehicle technology that we see in vehicles today, things like voice recognition systems. Over on the right, you can see a new infotainment display inside of a Tesla, so you can see this really huge screen. And so that's kind of changing some of the questions about distraction, but really the idea of driver distraction, taking your attention away from driving safely, has been around for a while and persists today. So I want to step back and talk about this from kind of a psychological perspective. And what I kind of want to do is convince you that there's some important limitations in the way our attention works, which make it really hard for us to be good at doing more than one thing at once, which is why we get driver distraction. And there's really two properties here. The first is that attention is a selective process. So if we think about how we see the world, we often think about it as being really this rich representation, that we're kind of taking it all in at one time. But what we know is that the way our attention works is that it selects bits and pieces, and we kind of have to actively attend to certain objects in the environment. So you can think of it kind of like this spotlight that has to move around the environment, sampling different things. And using that information, we kind of build this active mental representation of what's happening in the world. So the implication of this is that things that fall outside this spotlight are things we're not necessarily devoting our attention to, so therefore are things we might miss. The second component that really relates to driver distraction is this idea that our attention is not only selective, but it's limited in capacity. And you can think about attention as being kind of this reservoir, or maybe think of it as a cup full of water. And we have to allocate that amount of attention to various tasks that we're performing at any given time. So if we're driving, we're taking some amount of attention and we're allocating it to the task of driving. What's important, though, is that as the demand of the task increases, so as we go from a really boring driving task to a really demanding driving task, the amount of attention, as you would predict, that's required increases quite a bit. And the reason we get these distraction effects are when we add a secondary task, it does the same sort of thing. So it increases workload, which demands attention. And really where we run into problems is times where our attention is taxed beyond what's available. So situations where you have a secondary task and you also have a challenging driving task, you kind of run out of spare attentional capacity to allocate between the two. So at this point, you're probably, or maybe thinking, but wait, I'm actually really good at multitasking. I'm better than most people. I do it all the time throughout the day. But I kind of want to reiterate that you're probably not. And it's kind of this it's you, not me illusion. So if you ask people, are you a better driver than average? Something like 90% are going to respond that they're actually better drivers than the average driver, which we know just isn't true. And this is what we sometimes refer to as the better than average effect. But if you ask people, generally speaking, if they're better than others at anything, whether it's multitasking or driving, you're going to get these sorts of responses. So one of the reasons that we see so much multitasking in the car even though we know it's a bad thing, is that we tend to think ourselves that we're capable of doing it. It's the other drivers who maybe aren't. And when you look a little deeper into the research, you'll find that really it's very unlikely that we are what might be called supertaskers, so people who are able to do multiple things at once. It's really like less than 1% of the population who may even possibly be able to do multiple things at one time. So if you look even at samples of people who do really challenging tasks like jet pilots, it's really a tiny sample of those people. And what's really interesting is that you also see this kind of funny relationship where, funny and scary at the same time, I think, where you see the people who are actually the worst at multitasking, which are the people way down here. Those people actually report multitasking the most. So you see this sort of negative relationship where the people who are the worst at it are the ones who are doing it most frequently. Okay, so I want to kind of make the transition into distraction behind the wheel. I put this slide up there. This is getting to be somewhat a historical concept now, but traditionally we've kind of thought as researchers of distraction in different terms. So visual distraction, things that take your eyes off the road, and cognitive distraction, which is tasks that keep your eyes on the road but take your mind off the road. More and more, as I'll talk about here throughout, those two things are blurring, so it's not the case that you can have a purely cognitive task. Even tasks that are designed to be eyes on the road, like voice-controlled interfaces, you see a lot of visual demand, people looking down at the interfaces. And some of that might be due to the way some of these things are designed. So I mentioned that this idea of distraction has been around for a while. But to kind of illustrate this idea of visual distraction and eyes off road, I want to show a classic video. So this is a video from a researcher named John Senders, who we actually, at the driving assessment conference last week, had the unique opportunity of driving with him from Boston to Vermont. He's 97 years old and still an incredibly bright and interesting guy who actually tried to convince us to let him drive for a stretch of the road. And so this is research he did, I think, in the 50s. Is that right, Dan? 65, oh, okay. Let's hope this works.
World, and into this kind of business is the unusually permissive atmosphere and the interest in ideas. But their work isn't all desk work, as shown by this experiment on the attention span needed for safe driving. The experimenter is Against director, psychologist John Senders.
Driving along a section of Route 128, and I'm
So this
trying
is
to get
a
an estimate
visual
of
occlusion
the
mask. So every time it goes
demand
down,
by
he's
this
essentially
particular
blind.
section of road.
And the idea here is to look at the amount of time
And as the road
that mask can be
varies
down where you can
from
still
moment to
control the
moment
vehicle.
in the demand that it makes upon me, I must look more often or less often, as the case may be. The visor completely occludes my view during the period that it's down, and I must rely on some stored image or memory of what the road was before the visor went down. The half-second look that I have is enough to restore all the information that I should need in order to drive down the road. The records that we get of the time between looks at the road give us a direct measure of the difficulty presented to the driver by the road from moment to moment as we drive down it. The shorter the interval between looks, the more difficult that segment of road is to drive. On those periods, as you saw, where the interval was very long, the road was indeed easy. The interval then gives us a direct and quantitative measure of this rather elusive thing called difficulty.
Okay. So that's John driving. It's worth pointing out again that that's on a real road with real traffic. I think we actually drove some of the same stretch of road that he was on there, and not something you would ever want to do or be able to do these days, I guess. But what that shows is that you can basically mask vision for short periods, and still you're kind of working off the memory that you have, the working memory that you have, but as soon as you get to longer periods, you're going to start running into problems controlling the vehicle.
World and into
Again. And really this idea kind of has held up throughout time, and the idea essentially being that the longer your eyes are off the road, the more likely you are to run into problems. So what you're seeing here is essentially crash risk. Crash risk is a function of the amount of time your eyes are off the road. So you're looking at like 1 second glances away, so relatively short glance away, 2 second glances, and then 3 seconds or more. And you can see that this risk starts to really increase at 2 seconds. So at 2 seconds, you're seeing about a 5-time increase in crash risk, and that's doubling as you get out towards 3 seconds. So 2 seconds might not seem like a lot of time looking away from the road, but you're traveling several hundred feet if you're going 55 or 60 at that point. So really, glances and glances that take 2 seconds or more tend to be the really problematic occurrences of distraction. That's not to say that cognitive distraction can't be also really dangerous. So I'm going to show an example of some of the really high workload that occurs with some of these possibly poorly designed voice control systems. These things are getting better, but if you've interacted with like Siri on your phone or any kind of voice control system, there's probably been some time where you've gotten frustrated and you kind of experienced what this guy's going through. Hopefully this isn't too loud.
Media.
Radio.
Nej! Icon, song, media.
So he's trying to select a song
Radio.
from a playlist.
Nej! Playlist.
TV.
Nej!
This device is not available.
I'm not going to turn on my TV, I'm going to play music. Music!
You can operate many functions of the MMI quickly and easily with the speech dialogue system. You can interrupt the speech dialogue at any time by pressing the talk button on the steering wheel to enter a command. You can say,
I am
cancel at
commanding
any
you to
time.
shut up.
Press and hold the talk button.
Shut up!
Navigation.
Nej! I hate you!
Radio.
Nej! Music!
This name has not yet been stored.
Nickelback!
Map.
It's a map! Nickelback!
Okay, and he goes on like that for
Media.
quite a while. So you can think about, so his eyes never, if you look, never really leave the road. He's checking down every once in a while, but still he's really engaged in that sort of interaction with the vehicle. And there's really probably a pretty high level of workload that he's experiencing. So I mentioned that this dichotomy between visual and cognitive distraction really is blurring quite a bit. And that's the case because we're getting more and more complex interfaces inside of our cars. So again, this is the Tesla interface, which is really huge. You can see several different displays there. On the bottom right, you can see what's called a heads-up display. So this is a display that's being shown in the driver's field of view. And there's some really interesting potential there, but we really don't necessarily understand very well what impact showing something like this that may keep the driver's eyes up on the road, but also creates some other things for the driver to look at. We're still really trying to understand what impact those sorts of displays might have on distraction. But the types of distraction are really merging. There's really no pure cognitive distraction anymore, I would argue. Okay, so the impact of all this, I guess from a psychological perspective, is really an effect on what we would call situational awareness. And it's just what it sounds like. So it's an awareness of the driving situation at any given time. So if you were to close your eyes for a moment, you can picture, maybe you can picture some of the things about the scene that you just had. So maybe you could picture what color shirt I'm wearing or what color jacket I've got on. But that situational awareness is going to decline over time. So as your eyes are closed, if I move around the room, you're going to kind of lose a really strong awareness of what's happening in the situation. So the way this works in terms of distraction is when we're driving without other tasks, we see some fluctuations in this, but generally we're pretty aware of what's going on. The fluctuations here might be things like thinking about other things you have to do, picking your kid up at school, dropping off your dry cleaning, things like that. What we would describe as mind wandering. So if you've ever experienced those times where you drive a stretch and you can't really remember the road that you just drove down, those might be some of the dips that happen here. With something like cognitive distraction, you're going to see this decline in situational awareness. So your eyes are still up, you're still taking in information, but because you have that limited capacity, the amount of information you're processing is probably more limited. And then something that requires you to look away from the road, like sending a text message, for instance, is going to have these really big dips in situational awareness that correspond to actually taking your eyes off the road for periods of time. And the problem really occurs in the situation where you get something that you need to respond to in one of these dips in situational awareness. So if you have a kid drive out in front of you while you're looking down at your phone and you're not aware of what's happening in the situation, those are really the problematic instances in terms of distraction. In the video I showed before, times where the driver's looking down and starts to drift, you're not going to notice that, which is why the curb has to be responsible for bringing her back. I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we do at the National Advanced Driving Simulator with respect to distraction and some of the vehicle technology that's going to help alleviate some of the stuff I just talked about. First, I want to give kind of an introduction for those who aren't familiar with our simulator. So this is one of the largest and most advanced simulators in the world. And I'll play a video that hopefully works here. Okay, so you're going to see the simulator moving from the outside, and then this is inside of that dome. And so the movement on the outside is to replicate real-world motion. So the driver inside the car is feeling what it's like to actually be stopping, to be accelerating, to be turning. And those motion cues are really, really important for responding to things like potential hazard events. That sudden braking, to be able to kind of understand driver response behavior. Sorry. We have to be able to put drivers in situations that are really demanding. We have to put them in the situation where the kid steps out in front of them unexpectedly. And this tool allows us to do that. It's also worth noting that we not only use this tool, but we also collect data from real drivers on the road, what's called naturalistic data, some of which I showed at the beginning here. And that also kind of helps piece together the puzzle of what's happening with distraction. Sorry. Okay, so I want to show a few driver responses to responses or lack of responses in distraction situations. So this is a driver inside the simulator now who's going to get a distraction task. So he's going to get a task where he has to type some letters on a screen behind him. So you can imagine looking at your kid in the back seat, tinkering with their seatbelt or something. At the same time, we're going to put him in one of those really dangerous situations. So That white car in front of him is going to swerve to reveal a parked car on the side of the road. And you'll see what happens here. So you can see that without any kind of warning, he's totally unaware that that situation's developing. Again, this is kind of the worst case scenario, and one of the values in using the simulator is that we can put people over and over. We can put many different people in the same situation and get kind of an idea of how drivers are going to respond. In this sort of situation where they don't have much time and it's a very unexpected event, most drivers who are distracted collide with that car. So the good news is that while technology may be taking up some of our attention inside the vehicle, we also have a lot of vehicle technology that's out there and will be in vehicles very soon and is already in many vehicles that is really going to help us in these sort of distraction situations. And I'll talk about a few examples here, some of which you've heard: forward collision warning, lane departure, warning and lane keep assist, automatic emergency braking, and then driver monitoring systems that can actually monitor the driver and identify when the driver is distracted and give them some sort of feedback. Okay, so the first thing I'll show is a forward collision warning. So forward collision warning is just an alert that the driver gets when the vehicle detects that there's another vehicle that it's quickly approaching, essentially. So in this case, the warning consists of a seatbelt tug. So you can imagine your seatbelt kind of quickly tightening on you. Drivers don't like that experience. It's very alarming, which is kind of the point. But you'll see here how quickly that seatbelt tug gets the driver's attention back to the road. And again, this is in the same situation as the guy who crashed. So she'll look back, start performing her task. And you can see as soon as she gets that tug, her head is swiveling around. She's getting her attention back on the road. And in that case, giving herself plenty of time to respond to that event. We can do the same sort of thing for lane departures. So these are situations where the driver might drift off the road, like the young girl in the first video clip. We can also, because we have control over this situation, we can actually push drivers off the road in a really mean way. So if they're distracted, we can kind of shift them over and make it feel just like they had driven off the road and see how they respond. In this case, you're going to see a lane departure warning, which is a vibration in the seat. And the idea there is that it kind of replicates what it's like to drive over rumble strips. Okay, and it's simple like that, but what we can look at is how quickly drivers get back, how far they drift out of the lane, and we see that these sorts of fairly simple warnings are kind of effective in getting drivers to get their attention back to the road. And then one final piece I want to talk about is a more driver assistance technology. So instead of being a warning, this is technology that can actually intercede on behalf of the distracted driver. So I'm going to show you a clip from mycardoeswhat.org, which is a large public service campaign led by the University of Iowa and Dan in collaboration with the National Safety Council, which discusses automatic emergency braking. So these are systems that can actually brake for the driver when it detects a collision event that's likely to occur.
Did you see that? Whew. Scout didn't see that car coming, but this leash stopped him cold. Automatic emergency braking is kind of like Scout's leash. It may help prevent a catastrophe. It's amazing technology that's being added to new cars every day. Watch. Hi, I'm Rick, and this is my driving buddy, Scout. All right, let's say I'm distracted, or the car in front of me suddenly stops. Automatic emergency braking, or AEB, can hit the brakes faster than most humans can, possibly preventing a crash, or at the very least, making it less severe. To find out just how it works, Scout and I took a little road trip to the University of Iowa to meet Dr. Dan McGeehee. He and the team here use this ginormous driving simulator to study everything from truck drivers to distracted drivers. But today, Dan is taking us out for a real-life demonstration of automatic emergency braking. This sounds a little scary. What's your plan, Dan?
First off, we're on a closed course. Next, we're going to inflate that life-size vehicle up ahead.
I think I know what you're going to say next.
Don't try this at home.
Yep. Hey, Scout, did you hear that? Don't try this at home. All right, what now, Dan?
So it's all pretty automatic. If I don't stop the car, the brakes are going to come on really hard.
All right, let's go. Okay, we're cruising along.
And so if I get distracted by Scout or something in the back seat, I spill my coffee, it's going to just take over. I'm not going to touch the brake. Let's just see what happens.
Wow, that was really cool. I can see how that could save lives.
Yeah, but remember that AEB still may not be able to stop in time. So it's really important that a driver take evasive action by braking and sometimes steering to safety. Also, Rick, AEB may not always prevent a crash, but it could reduce the severity, and we even hope it will save some lives.
Wow, and we even had room to spare. That is amazing. Okay, $1,000,000 question. How's it work?
AEB uses forward-looking radar and or cameras to look ahead for a potential crash.
Hey, I've read that AEB is so promising that car companies are thinking about making this feature standard, like seatbelts or airbags.
It's also been proposed that cars may only receive the government's 5-star rating if they have AEB on board.
Wow, that is incredible. This has been great. Hey, if you want to check out more safety features, go to all of our pages. See our videos, animations, and quick guides. Oh, thanks, Dan. This has been absolutely amazing. Remember, you are your car's best safety feature. No more, drive safer. Visit mycardoeswhat.org. Hey, Scout, we're all done here. High five, buddy. Yeah.
Okay. And so with that, I think I'll wrap up. I'm happy to take questions, but as always, I'll direct anyone who's interested to our website. We also are always looking for research participants. They really are kind of the integral piece to all of the work that we do. So drivingstudies.com, you can sign up to join our registry and participate in our studies. And for learning more about some of this assistive technology and some of the new technology that might be in your vehicle, mycardoeswhat.org and Rick and Scout. All right, and thank you very much.
Oh, don't go though, because we can ask questions now.
Yeah.
And I have the microphone, so if you want to ask a question, just let me know. So kudos to using the dog. It's very clever. Like that a lot.
The guy and his dog always first.
Oh, yeah. So where does the funding come from your program? And Dan, if you want to answer, just let me know and I'll hand you the microphone. John?
Yeah, sure. So we get money from several different sources. We get money from the Department of Transportation, both the federal DOT and the Iowa DOT. And we also get money from different entities and industries, so different auto manufacturers, suppliers. So it comes from several different sources.
I mean, the research to me is fascinating. And so did you have, did the Iowa legislature, the representatives or the senators, did they come and ask for your input when they were designing the bill, or was that done independently of what you do at NADS?
As far as I know, it was done independently. Dan can maybe help me out on this one. I don't know that we received any inquiries, but.
Yeah, legislation is very incremental, and it actually took about 5 years to get this through. So every year, I would paddle my canoe to Des Moines and testify in front of the House and Senate Transportation Committees and talk about many of the things that Dr. Gaspar talked about today. And it takes many years to get a consensus in the legislature. So we have a number of people from the transportation committees who come visit. It takes us to go talk to them, the state patrol, many different people from the state.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we're always happy to talk about the research and as much as the research can drive the decision-making, it's a good thing.
What I find, I have a Prius, and I bought the first model, and I remember people talking to me, I don't know if you're familiar with the first model of the Prius, it has a screen, which I was addicted to, and my current one, 2 years old, I'm still addicted to, because it shows you how much gas you're burning and how much energy you're storing, which I'm assuming is partially what that Tesla screen is. And my screen is kind of big, but that Tesla screen is enormous, and it doesn't seem like, it doesn't make any sense to me that that's even legal to have that gigantic of a distraction on the dashboard.
Well, I think it depends on, in some ways, on how you're using that screen and when you're using that screen. I think for certain situations, it can be, that information can be really helpful. So knowing how much gas you have left or how much room you have to make it to a certain location can be really helpful. And having navigation inside your car is oftentimes, for those who are easily lost, really beneficial. But I think really when these things are designed and kind of incremented, that you have to kind of take into account how people are actually going to interact with some of these things. So the voice control system that I showed is a good example. One of the problems with those sorts of things is that the way the menus are set up is that you have to work your way through several different menus, and you have to have a really good mental model of the way that the system works. And it doesn't necessarily work in the way that we would naturally interact with another human who we're trying to tell how to open our music or something like that. So I think the design is kind of always changing and hopefully always trying to move towards understanding ways to limit the types of interactions that are going to cause problems on the road.
Because you train yourself, if what you're trying to do is figure out, the optimum way to use your car, to drive your car for gas mileage. I mean, you're training yourself to look at it every now and then, and you can see when it's moving. But I think a bigger screen just is more, it has to be somewhat more distracting.
It certainly is more opportunity to put things on there, which there's more temptation there, yes.
It's also just bigger.
It's
small screen,
right.
little type, as well as big type, big screen.
Yeah.
And I think it's in the whole idea about when you ask people if they're better than average, in any walk of life, people are always saying they're better than average, because who wants to be average? But 90% of people can't be better than average because somebody has to be average. So that's it's an interesting phenomenon.
Exactly. And one of the problems, at least as far as distraction goes, is that we don't really get feedback about how distracted we are. So we're not crashing all the time because we're distracted. And oftentimes it's the opposite, that we've been distracted so many times that we give ourselves this illusion that we're not impaired in any way. And it really takes the coincidence of the wrong situation and the wrong activity to produce a crash. And that's
So under the rubric of distracted driving, would falling asleep, I mean, the sleep deprivation, is that part of distracted driving, or is that a whole different category?
I would categorize it as impaired driving. So it's one of kind of the 4 or 5 main areas of impairment that we typically look at. We also do work on driver distraction, so we get drivers in and keep them up all night and then have them drive for 4 hours in the simulator.
For 4 hours?
Yes. And we actually have people fall asleep and run off the road. Recently, the last study we ran, we had someone fall asleep, depart the road, cross over the median and enter the oncoming lanes of traffic, and then wake back up without realizing that they had crossed over the interstate and were headed in the wrong direction. So you see some really scary stuff with drowsy drivers as well. And some of this assistive technology could also certainly be beneficial there, things that keep the driver in the roadway. We're doing some work now with driver monitoring systems that can detect when a driver's eyes are closed.
Well, I think I've seen an Audi commercial. I'm not sure if it's Audi or not, where they are touting that they have that in their newest generation of cars, which...
Yep, absolutely. So we're actually pretty good at detecting when someone's falling asleep, but we don't really know much about what we should do once they're falling asleep. So most of us have that same kind of illusion that we're able to push through being drowsy when we're driving, even though all of us have probably experienced like the head nodding that happens when you're pretty drowsy. So we're working now to kind of understand what sorts of messages you can provide to the driver to actually get them to pull over and get a coffee or to take a short nap. things that we know actually work for drowsiness.
So next week, when we talk about the driverless car, I mean, is that really the solution to people's inability to stay awake or to be not distracted?
I think I'll leave that one for Dan.
next
but
week. Yes, stay tuned.
Yeah, I think some of this technology really has the potential to help with some of that impairment. Some of these things like distraction I think it's really kind of wishful thinking to think that no one's going to touch their cell phone, even if we have a law saying you can't send text messages. So some of these kind of backup systems, as I would call them, could be really helpful in that regard.
And for things that you have no control over, even if you aren't distracted, like a squirrel or a deer or...
Exactly. As the video mentioned, some of these systems respond actually faster than you could respond yourself. So having those sorts of assistive systems is really helpful, I think, and there's not much of a downside to having those things installed.
No, yeah. Nobody wants to be in an accident, so.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any more questions?
So is the...
Oh, wait.
On the braking, automatic braking system, is it detecting large objects or something small like a squirrel?
So it's detecting large objects, it's detecting vehicle-sized objects.
Okay, that's what I was curious about.
There's systems that will also detect things like pedestrians stepping into the road. I don't think, unless I'm wrong, that it's detecting squirrels necessarily.
Well, it's just that you mentioned it, and then I thought, well, wait a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had a car, that inflatable car in front of you. How about the pedestrian?
Yeah, we have inflatable pedestrians too, that we can pull out in front.
Yeah.
Inflatable pedestrians.
Okay. We do.
We need to know.
I wish I could pull up a picture. They're kind of creepy looking. They don't have faces or anything.
That's probably better not to. Well, thank you very much. This was,
Thank you.
You know, I've always wondered what it was like, and since I got rejected to be a drunk driver, I still haven't had an experience of being out at the simulator. So if someone wanted to take a tour, would they just contact the...
Yes, absolutely. If you want to send me an email or Dan an email or anyone on our website, that's a good way to get in touch with us. But we're happy to give tours and to get people in the simulator, show them some of this technology anytime.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Sure,
Happy
thank you.
driving. Safe driving.